Hi everyone, welcome back to our chapter on memory. Something's happening. Okay, cool. In this lecture, we're going to talk about short-term memory. You'll notice that I switch back and forth between calling it short-term memory and working memory. For this class, we're going to call them the exact same thing. So when I talk about one, I'm talking about the other, okay? If you take a future class on memory, then they might split it up, but it's essentially the same thing. So let's just call it the same. Now, remember that this is part of those three components theories of memory. So last time we talked about sensory memory, and now we've got short-term memory. And so this is because our attentional capabilities are limited, so most information in sensory memory is easily faded away. But the parts that are going to stick around, they go from sensory memory into short-term memory. So this is through selective attention, where a small portion of that sensory memory will enter into the short-term memory, which holds the information that we are conscious of at any given time. So again, it's sometimes called working memory because it's the conscious processing, coding, or the stuff we're currently working on. So short-term memory is defined as temporarily stores and processes a limited amount of information in the consciousness. Now, it does have a limited capacity, so this is where we get that 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. So if we're talking about, say, I give you a list of numbers, in your short-term memory, you're able to hold about 7 different numbers at a time. So that plus or minus 2 is where we get that range of 5 to 9. So at any point of time, your short-term memory can hold 5 to 9 pieces of information at a time. It also has a limited duration of about 20 seconds or so, and this is without a control process. So, for instance, if you're being introduced to someone and then you immediately forget their name once we start a conversation, that's because their name is going to be one piece of information, one bit, right? And then when you start a conversation, you're going to learn more different bits about them. And eventually, you're not going to have room in your short-term memory for other bits. So the first bit that you learned might disappear. So that's why you might forget their name, because you're gathering so much information at once that you can't remember everything. So if we want things to last longer, last more than 20 seconds, you're going to have to use some kind of control process. So a control process could be like rehearsal. So you'll repeat something multiple times, and that will allow you to remember it longer. So how do we test short-term memory? What we're going to do is first, let's talk about one of the very first studies. So this curve was created by this old white dude up here called Ebbinghaus, and he really studied the act of forgetting. And so what he would do was he would give people a list of words, a very long list, and then he would ask you to recall as many of those words as you can. And so you can see here how you kind of forget things. So down on the x-axis, we have the delay before recall, so how long after you heard a list of words that you're asked to recall, and this is in seconds. And then on the y-axis, we have the percent recall. So if we have, say, 10 words, then after just 3 seconds, you'll be able to recall 8 of those words, so 80%. And then the more time that passes, the less and less words you're going to be able to recall, until eventually, at about 18 to 20 seconds, you're not going to be able to recall any of them. And so this is where we get that limited duration of about 20 seconds. Now, of course, again, this is without using any sort of control process. So how is the information represented in our short-term or working memory? So we have what we call information storage. So we have 4 different types. We have visual, phonologically, semantically, and action. So visually would be images, so remembering different images. Phonologically would be sounds, so what you're hearing. Semantically would be the meaning behind something. So this would involve more of the processing than the sensation. And then we've got action, so motor patterns. So these action ones could really come into play, say if you're learning a dance, then you're going to use information storage in an action way. Now, you can have errors in your memory as well, so you might remember something wrong, and this can happen if you try to store too much information in one system too quickly. So the best way to remember things is to be able to store things in different storage areas so that you can remember more. So don't just remember what I'm saying, try to also remember what it means, what I'm saying. And then the graphs. The graphs are something different, so you can put that in your visual storage area. So you're breaking the information up into different storage systems, and that way you're able to remember more. And you're not going to misremember things or forget to store things in your short-term memory. So, for example, with physical actions such as playing golf or the drums, then that's, again, where we can encode patterns of movement, but we can also do, remember how things sound, especially with the drums, right? So how do we increase our short-term memory capacity? Right? So if we usually we can only hold about 7 things, plus or minus 2, that's not a lot of things. So how can we increase the capacity? The answer is we have to use the systems that allow us to increase the capacity in storage. So again, these are going to be those control processes. So one way of doing that is what we call chunking. So this is where we break down a big group into smaller bits, or group units into larger bits. So for example, phone numbers. Then we're taking a large number of numbers, right? So that's 10 numbers. And we're going to chunk them, or we're going to group them together as one piece of information. So we're going to take what was 10 bits and group it together or chunk it together to create 1 bit. And that way we're not taking up as much room in our short-term memory. We also do this sometimes, or all the time really, when we're reading, where instead of using short-term memory to remember every single letter, we would chunk things into words. So again, we're taking a bunch of smaller bits and chunking them into meaningful units of words. So here's some nice, pretty graphs of just showing how things can happen. So in this case, then we're talking about in the game chess. I like this example right now because I just finished watching The Queen's Gambit on Netflix. Would highly recommend. It was a great TV show, guys. But in the game of chess, then you need to know the proper game positions of chess, right? So why does a master of chess do better than a beginner of chess? And why that is because the master does a better job because they can chunk based on game positions. So a lot of placements or game positions, they can chunk them into groups that kind of mean the same thing. And so the master is able to hold more information in their mind at a time because they know how the proper game positions are. Whereas a beginner isn't as aware of that, so they're not able to use chunking. So they're only going to be able to remember a few of the correct placements. Now, if we take away the advantage of a master, so if we just randomly place pieces on the board that aren't an actual game position, then the masters can no longer use chunking because they can't use their previous knowledge. You can't group things in a meaningful way. So now you can see how the master and the beginner are on an equal playing field. Okay? So this is really showing the advantage of being able to use chunking. And also that as you learn something, you're going to be able to chunk things together more easily, and therefore you'll be able to learn and you'll be better at different activities. Now, that was how to increase the number of things in your short-term memory, but we can also increase our short-term memory duration, so the amount of time things stay in the short-term memory. And again, these are called control processes. So the first one is maintenance rehearsal, and so this is just simple repetition. So, for instance, if I say, I want you to remember a list of words, and I give you apple, chair, clock, map, box, then maintenance rehearsal is you're going to sit there and repeat in your mind those 5 words I just gave you, right? Now, a different type is elaborative rehearsal, and this is where you really focus on the meaning. So you elaborate on the material in thinking about how it applies to our lives. So you can think about like chair, like, okay, I'm sitting on a chair, I'm looking at a clock, stuff like that. And so you're putting meaning to the words and you're focusing on the meaning, and by adding a meaning, then you're going to allow yourself to remember these things longer. Whereas with maintenance rehearsal, you're not putting a meaning, you're just repeating things over and over and over again until you need to recall it. Now, again, remember, I do, for this class, that I'm talking about short-term memory and working memory as the same thing. But your textbook does kind of define working memory separately. So working memory is, again, very similar to short-term memory. I want you to think about them the same. But working memory specifically is a limited capacity system for storage and manipulation of information for complex tasks. In other words, it's holding information in the active memory to work on it. So again, it's your short-term memory, but it's the specific short-term memory things that you're working on right now. So when I'm asking you to remember 5 words in a list, you're actively working on those 5 things. You're remembering those 5 things because I'm telling you to, right? But working memory is a different type of short-term memory in that you can recall previous information, you can bring things out of storage and hold them in working memory to use them. But in essence, it's the same as short-term memory because it has the same duration of about 20 seconds. And it also, you can only work on so much bits of information at a time. So we still have that 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. And if we look at this lovely graph down here, the axes are the exact same as that graph I showed you before from that old white dude, but this one's looking at working memory, so recalling information. But you can see how the forgetting curve is almost exactly the same as with short-term memory. So again, we're just showing that whether you're gaining new information or recalling old information, your short-term working memory, you only have so much, it only holds things for so much time, and unless you're using one of our control processes. So again, your textbook does kind of break down the kind of difference between short-term and working memory. But again, for the sake of this class, I'm going to refer to the two as the same. Short-term memory tends to be made up of a single component, whereas working memory has multiple components. Because usually when you're using working memory, then you'll have been able to chunk things together. Okay, so short-term memory is usually gaining information, whereas working memory is the recall of previously known information, so you'll be able to use chunking better. Short-term memory is usually concerned with storing information, so that's getting new information, and working memory is manipulating information, so manipulating that information you already have. Okay, but again, you can really think of them as the same, but that's kind of the small difference that you might hear about.